Welcome to Guest of the Year. I'm the host. My name's Mike. Today's setlist curator is author and executive director and publisher at Boa Editions, Peter Connors. Peter has written 9 books spanning nonfiction, fiction, and poetry, including Growing Up Dead, Jamaica, White Hand Society, and the novel Merch Table Blues. His writing on the Grateful Dead and jam band culture has made him one of the scene's foremost chroniclers. I wanted to have Peter on to mark the 49th anniversary of the Barton Hall show and talk about his incredible book, Cornell 77, The Music, Myth, and Magnificence of the Grateful Dead's concert at Barton Hall. The book was included in Rhino's Grammy-nominated May 1977 Get Shown the Light box set and digs into how Cornell became one of the most mythologized live performances in rock history. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
All right, here's how the game works. We'll play the first part of a Grateful Dead live track, and each contestant will use the messaging system to silently guess which year the performance is from. Contestants who are all on a video conference together can message in their guesses at any time during the clip or in the 10 seconds after it concludes. Whoever is furthest off is eliminated. The final 2 contestants will hear 3 tracks, and whoever is the least number of years off in aggregate wins and continues on to next week. Our 2-time returning champ Charles is here. We'll meet the rest of the Deadheads in a moment, but first, without further ado, the Grateful Dead. It was Fire on the Mountain at Kingswood Music Theatre in Maple, Ontario on June 30th, 1987. Peter, tell us about that one.
So I picked this one for a couple different reasons. One, it was my first show, so I'm like, I got to do that one. I was 16 years old. I live in Rochester, New York, so we hopped over the border to Toronto. And actually, that's the beginning of my book, Growing Up Dead. I described that whole scene. But one of the neat things about that one is you heard Phil's bass get super loud for a couple seconds, and everybody loses their mind. Well, if you heard, like, you could hear everybody kind of losing their mind right before that. The sun was going down behind where the band was playing, and the whole sky was just lit up, and it was one of those times where you're like, okay, I'm pretty sure these guys controlled, like, the weather too. Like, it was just so perfect, right? So everybody was kind of turned around to look at this sunset because it was just that good. And Phil all of a sudden hits those bass notes, and the whole place just, like, exploded. So that's why I picked that one.
Your book, Cornell 77, is not a list of reasons why Cornell 77 is the best Grateful Dead show ever. But if you had to argue why it is the greatest show ever, what would that argument be?
I would never fall into that trap with a bunch of deadheads. What do you think? I was just born? If I had to argue, I think they played pretty much everything they played it exquisitely. It's hard to argue against that. Whether it's the best or not is, up for grabs. But is it a fucking smoking show? Like, absolutely. There's no way you can listen to that show and say it's not a ripping show. Like, it just is, So my argument would be consistency throughout that show. There's very few just complete, there's no total train crashes. And the, sort of missteps or whatever are the Grateful Dead adorable. They're just what you want to hear a little bit of. So, it's just a great show all the way through.
You listen to Cornell probably hundreds of times writing this book. Did it ever get old? Because I've listened to like 30 times and it has not gotten old for me.
I still go back and listen to it. Yeah, it's funny because Sirius played it on the anniversary or whatever. I got in my car and it was playing. and I couldn't turn it off, and I've listened to it so many times, but, it keeps like all Grateful Dead music, it just keeps delivering, right? So just when you think you've heard all the facets, you're like, "Oh my god, what did Keith just do there?" You know what I mean? Or, "Oh my god, like, listen to those harmonies," or whatever it might be. So, no, I know I don't get sick of it. I mean, I wouldn't that's not where I would pick and just put it on if I'm just chilling out or whatever because it's so burned into my brain, but once it's playing, I'm hard pressed to stop it.
Damn, I was hoping that was the case. Right on. Okay, well, so the closest was 1988, and that was Liam. Liam is 26. He lives in Brooklyn by way of Huntersville, North Carolina. Way to go, Liam. What were you hearing there?
Honestly, for the longest time, I thought it was 86. And then towards the end, I was dialed in on 87. But then I just switched my sound. I switched it up because I thought the sound was like a little bit more like stadium-esque, that I relate more to 88. But I was even upset with myself for being a year off. I was dialed in on 87 until the last second. But next time I get it.
I love it. Way to go, Liam. So next closest was Charles. Charles is our two-time returning champ, going for a three-peat. He's 45 from Wellsville, New York. Charles guessed 1989.
Yeah, so initially I thought 90s, and then I couldn't tell if it was Brett or Bruce on keys. There was a piano in there. And then there was a little flourish at the end that was like totally Brett. And I was like, it's obviously Brett. And I was like, well, I'm just going to go 89. So at least I was close.
Way to go, Charles. So everyone's on in the next round because Sean and John both guessed 1990. Sean is 29 from Boston. What were you hearing on the keys, Sean?
I'll admit the 80s are just a weak. They're my blind spot with Dead. I was kind of like with Charles, where I couldn't tell if it's Bruce or Brent. I was thinking like 87, 88, and then I heard Jerry's voice, and voice sounded a little rougher than I was expecting. So that made me think maybe it's later on. That's why I went ultimately with 1990.
Way to go. And John, 29 from Queens, also 1990.
Yeah, I was listening to Bobby a lot. I always tend to try to listen to Bobby first and what he's doing. I was struggling a little bit. I mean, obviously when Jerry came in, he sounded a little haggard. So I was kind of like, it's got to be 87 on. I just kind of leaned a little more towards 90 because it seemed like Bob and Phil were both pretty high in the mix. But I was struggling.
Cool. Everyone's on to the next round. Let's hear Peter's next track. The guesses are in. Dark Star, February 13th, 1970 at Fillmore East in New York. Peter, tell us about that Dark Star.
It's my favorite Dark Star. It's just sort of my go-to Dark Star, and they're all great for different reasons, but I just go back to that one all the time, and it's a fantastic show. And I don't know, it's one of those ones on the East Coast. It was an East Coast show, but it was Bill Graham's house at Fillmore East at that time, and so it was like they're so loose and they're so comfortable, and they were playing so much right then, and everybody's just on. So one of my group texts is all the guys that I toured with, or a bunch of guys that I toured with. And pretty much every day, somebody in that group texts that it's 213 wherever they are in the country. So it's also, for me personally, it's just a running thing. 213 like runs through pretty much every day of my life. 213 pops up at some level. So it's got personal significance, and it's also just a fantastic Dark Star.
Going back to the, Barton Hall and everyone liking it the best. Why do you think Deadheads and people in general like ranking stuff so much?
It's a really fascinating question. Honestly, I've thought about it a lot, and I've heard everything from that there's a lot of people on the spectrum who are into the Grateful Dead, which sounds like, like it's some sort of backhanded, insult or whatever. I don't think it is. I think it's actually made a lot of sense to me when I first heard that, because when you look at something like Dead Base, like, that is so freaking obsessive that I'm sorry, but somebody with a completely obsessive mind had to do that, and that sort of tracks with, that whole being on the spectrum and sort of laser focusing in on things. But I think also just the nature of the shows and being different, every time and, just sort of obsessively sort of digging into that. The taping stuff played a role in it. So I don't know, there's all sorts of reasons, but quite honestly, that sort of idea of people being on the spectrum, sort of starting that off, it really resonated with me as quite possibly true, especially maybe early on, like the 60s, 70s guys who started sort of set the template for this sort of geekiness.
Yeah, Steve Silberman popped up in your book a lot. Did you get a
Yeah.
chance to talk to him?
Yeah, I knew Steve, pretty well through Grateful Dead channels. He was awesome, awesome guy, and of course wrote. I'm trying to maybe you know the title of his book, but he sort of wrote the
Skeleton
book.
Key, maybe was that?
Well, he did do that, absolutely,
Yeah.
but he wrote a book on autism.
Yeah, Neural Tribes.
Oh, right.
Yeah, Neurotribes, which was, I know just a amazing book that sort of, defined where things stood with people's understanding at that time. And Steve was just an amazing dude. He was really, really cool guy. So it was sad loss to not have him around.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. So two people got it, Sean and Liam. Sean, did you know the show?
I did not know the show, but it just sounded very 1970 to me. This was one where it was hard to tell. Maybe it's just my headphones if there were two drummers or not, but towards the end I was definitely able to tell Mickey's there also. I was thinking somewhere between 69 and 71, and like 69 always sounds dirtier to me. This sounded much more clean. So that's why I ultimately went with 70.
Sure. Liam, you also guessed 1970. Living up to your promise to not be off on the next one. Way to go. Why 1970?
I was close to saying 69, to be honest, but I think at the end of the day, the tones were just a little bit closer to what they were playing with in 1970 or 1971. I think if you put like a Phil Maurice 71 versus 70 show up to each other, they sound pretty damn similar in terms of like equipment being used. I honestly thought that this was the Georgia show where they borrowed the Allman Brothers equipment initially, but stand corrected. At least I was in the same year.
Way to go, Liam. So Charles and John both guessed 69, so everyone's on to the next round again. Charles, 69.
Yeah, like that was the first thing I wrote down, just the tone. And I was trying to figure out the song. I'm like, what song is this? And like, they're in a good jam when you don't know what the song is. Like they went way out. Dark Star didn't occur to me. But yeah, like Phil's bass, kind of had that old school sound before it got processed. I could catch two drums at the end there. But yeah, that's why I chose 69.
Did you have a guess for what song it was?
I had no clue. Yeah.
Right on. And John, did you know what song it was? Also 69.
I knew it was Dark Star, but I was starting to like think like it could be the Beautiful Jam from 71. But I really wanted to I really was thinking 70. I just tried to kind of play the game and put 69. I actually recently listened to this show because I've been listening to all the shows that occurred in New York City, all the boroughs, which is like 169 or so. Most of them obviously being in Manhattan. But this was I guess the third show that they played in New York, I believe. And it's really topical because the night before they played at a place called Ngano's, but it's like rumored to not have happened. There's no archive, no recording of it. But yeah, I tried to play the game. So that's why I put 69.
Where did the idea come from to listen to all the New York shows?
Yeah. So like I had never lived in a place really that the Grateful Dead had ever played. Because I lived in Lexington, Kentucky before I moved to New York, and they played one show there in 1978. at Rep Arena. And I wanted to move to New York for the music scene. I mean, there's a few reasons, but the music scene was maybe number one. And the history of the Grateful Dead is so strong here. And I kind of had this idea like 6 or 7 months ago. It was like, what if I like documented all the places that the Grateful Dead played in New York City? Some of them are still around, obviously, like MSG, the Beacon, and a lot of them aren't. Obviously, the Fillmore East is like an Apple Bank or something now, and like 46th Street Rock Palace in Brooklyn is like demolished, and a lot of these buildings that were a lot of the buildings that were in like the East Village and that part of the city, like they're no longer there. So it's just I just thought like maybe I could do like a little documentary, kind of like showing around these places, talking about the history and going that route. I'm kind of still in the beginning of that process, like doing some of the research. I'm kind of ready to start filming some things, but there's still some shows that like I don't have a ton of information on that I'd really would like to know more about, like the 46th Street Rock Palace in Brooklyn and then Ungano's. So if anybody listening to this was there or has any intel, please reach out to me because I would love to talk to you a little bit.
Insanely cool idea. Can't wait to watch it, John. Cool. Everyone's on to the next round. Let's hear Peter's next track. The guesses are in. It was playing in the band at Poly Pavilion in Los Angeles on November 17th, 1973. Peter, another one that was kind of hard to place, maybe what song it was even.
Yeah, excuse me. So, you asked me about listening to Cornell 77. I would say and I said, oh, it's not, the first thing I would put on right now, but a lot of times I find myself going to 73 shows. And I don't know, there's something phenomenal about them. But one of my favorite things that happens in 73 is these monster playing in the bands that are just so fearless, and so adventurous. And like that little clip, all I could think was like, we're swimming underwater, we're just swimming around underwater. Every time they create a different environment with that. And it to me, it kind of went where Dark Stars, what made Dark Stars so great was sort of what happened with plans, especially in 73 in those middle sections. And then they come out of them with just that, incredible dynamic that brings you back into the song. So it's just one of my favorite things to listen to, just any 73 playing.
Nice. Yeah, obviously they dispensed with the Gonzo playing in the bands. And I know on their goal for playing Barton Hall was to expand their fan base. Do you feel like the set list at Cornell reflected that ambition?
I don't think that anything intentional like that, is happening. I don't think they were ever capable of that level of sort of calculation, but playing the East Coast college campuses was extremely thought out, and people forget that wasn't a thing that bands did, at that time when the Dead started doing them. And so they really set a template for bands sort of playing in these colleges and building an audience that way. And of course, the tapes helped a ton. So I don't know about the set list itself, but the choice of playing at schools up and down the East Coast was definitely thought out, and it proved to be an amazingly brilliant, prescient decision.
Okay, well, so two people got it, Sean and Liam. Sean, 73. Nice pull.
73 is hands down my favorite year for the Dead for a lot of the same reasons Peter said. Like they're just so fearless and adventurous on on the jams that they do, especially playing in the band. I think the fall 73 has some really top-notch shows, both in it kind of like they combine all of the best of the Dead. Like the first sets will be very rockin', very high energy, tight, and then second set just goes off into outer space. I do know this show, the Pauley Pavilion, didn't know well enough to call that it was this show specifically, but I was from the get-go, I was like, this is a 73 playing in the band. Keith is I think the giveaway for me, because I think 73 is the first time he really settles in and, comes into his own after about, a year and a half or so in the band. So that was the giveaway for me, is listen to what Keith was doing.
Nice observation, John. Way to go. Liam, also 73.
73, same thing as Sean. Probably my favorite year. So good. It's like between 73 and 74, stuff like that, or like later 72, but they all have distinct sounds. And then the 74, what sets apart 74 and 73 is the wall just has a particular sound when it's recorded. Also a show I'm very fond of. Really good Races On. Really good Road Jimmy. Good pick, Peter.
Good China Rider on that show also.
Oh yeah, that one as well is good.
That was a Dave's picks, right?
Yeah, it was a recent Dave's picks.
Yeah. So John gets 72 and Charles gets 74. So they're equal 1 year off each. So again, we're at the same position.
Mutually assured destruction.
Yeah, I know.
There we go. All right.
Charles, 74.
Yeah, well, looking at my notes here, the fat bass sound, it's usually 73 or 74. Definitely heard that. My next note is Way Out. What song? So it's definitely, it adds an element of challenge, which I enjoy, like when you don't know what the song is, because that's a big element of playing this game. You know what the song is. You're like, well, I know they played it in heavy rotation this year or that year, or we can eliminate certain years for certain songs. So not knowing exactly what the song is makes it a little more challenging. Way Out jam there. I'm going to have to go check out that show again. But to me, it sounded very clear, which I associate with 74 when the Wall of Sound was fully operational. Usually 73 is a little muddier. So that's why I went with 74. But yeah, good pick there, Peter.
John, 72.
Yeah, I was thinking late 72. Once again, I was trying to play the game. I really was thinking 73, 72, and kind of wanted to go with 73, but just was like, I'll just go with 72. But like, I see playing in the band as the 1B to the 1A of Dark Star as jam vehicles of the Dead. Like, it's probably my favorite, but they did so much with those two songs, and like I'm especially partial to playing that. I did know it was a playing. I couldn't discern from 72 or 73.
Sure. We're gonna run out of songs. Are you guys cool for like everyone? We just start over. We hear 3 more songs, and whoever's the least number of years off over 3 songs wins.
Sure, yeah.
So essentially like a full-on we're all in the finals?
Yeah, a 4-person finals.
Love it.
Cool. Liam, how'd you get into the Dead?
I got into the Dead because initially I was into, probably like age 13, 14, I was into Creedence Clearwater. And my father always pushed me towards the Dead's music, but I was always confused by it because at the same time I was like listening to Fugazi and other stuff, and I'd hear the name like Grateful Dead and I expected it to be heavy. And around the same time I was going to the Dead's first shows as Dead and Company, and I had gone to like maybe 2 or 3 at that point. Didn't really do anything for me. And then I think around the age of like 16 or 17, I remember hearing Europe 72, China Rider, and it all just clicked. I remember like the exact moment. I remember the day of the year, where I was in the house and everything else. But I'm a very obsessive person. If I'm into something, I'm into it so much. And that's just been my life ever since that day, probably about 10 years ago.
When you're at a bar, the music's loud and you're trying to explain Seastones to people, how do you explain it?
I say that it's a custom hi-fi company, essentially. I make custom custom rigs and custom enclosures. And it just depends. For the most part, I have like consistent products that go with Seastones. And then we're willing also to meet other people's needs. Like say somebody wants like a 4-to-1 in-home audio system, we'll build enclosures for that. And then for the most part, we just sell like 2 sizes of speakers for in-home audio use as well as PA use.
How'd you learn how to do that?
It's been like the last 4 years of my life, essentially. So my day job is stonemasonry, and my project manager for that used to be a speaker builder for a pretty prolific speaker company in the city. And he kind of just showed me the ropes, essentially. It started off as him and I, and then it just snowballed into what it is nowadays. Still a lot to learn.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan. Seastones is in the show notes. I'll include there. It's the shit.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, for the first time ever, we've got 4 contestants in the finals. Whoever is the least number of years off in aggregate wins. Let's hear Peter's pick.
I would say that the blame was mine, but I suspected something worse. Well, my brother looks like me, this I understand. The silent war, the bloody both our hands.
Okay, so it was my brother Esau at Silver Stadium in Rochester, New York, on July 2nd, 1987. It was a Matrix, and the tape came from Jim Voss. Peter, another New York show.
Yeah, I had to put in at least one Rochester one. That is where I'm from, and the city has a great, great, great history of amazing Grateful Dead concerts, and that was my second one ever. But I just love Brother Esau, and it was one of my great, like, it just kills me that they stopped playing it because it's such a great Rippin' Bobby, like, first set song, you know? But as I'm listening to you guys, you're amazing at this game, and I'm like, okay, maybe this one's too easy because it's got such a limited sort of playing shelf life of about 3 years, you know? But anyway, I love My Brother Esau. I think it's a great song, and I wish they had kept playing it, but they did not.
You courted the Grateful Dead surviving members for the book. At what point did you realize, like, this isn't going to happen and you had to write the book without that information?
Right. So I'd gotten a chance to interview everybody for my book Jamaica earlier and had a sort of sense of where people were coming from. And I knew that the Dead were just not big, like this is an anniversary people, you know, it would get foisted on them. You know what I mean? Like about the time that I started getting tapes and stuff was 85. So it was at that point, you know, the 20th, right? And I don't think they cared. And I don't think they care about any anniversary. So I did hear from Weir, and he was basically like, you know, I don't really remember it, but I'll let you know. And then, you know, of course, he has this whole little interview you can see on YouTube where he starts talking about how Cornell never happened. And he's just playing with everybody's fear, right? Never trust a prankster. And I'll be honest with you, at some level, it's kind of more interesting talking to the people who are taking the tickets than talking to the musician who doesn't really remember it. And it was one of a million gigs, you know, which isn't to say I wouldn't have loved to have them on the record for it. But I loved hearing the stories of the guys who had to put on the show, too, you know, and what they went through. So, and to me, like, that's our world much more, you know, the fans who like came out and it was snowing. They went in shorts and came out and it was snowing, and that blew their minds. Like, I love talking to other Deadheads about their experiences. So,
yeah, how did you find those Deadheads who were at the show and worked the show?
I kind of worked my way back from person to person, you know, and that happens a lot of times when and John, you'll probably have this when you start doing your project too, you know. You talk to somebody And they were like, oh, but you really got to talk to this guy. And then you always got to ask, say, can you make an introduction for me? And then, they'll email or whatever, or give you a number and you get turned on that way. So a lot of it's just sort of chasing down one after another, and those things just open up. And that's what happened with a lot of the people on the Cornell Concert Commission who put on this show. It's like, you really got to talk to this guy. You got to talk to this guy. And that's kind of how research projects usually work. You do your research and you dig in and you see what you can find out of archives and things like that. But as far as talking to people, you just got to sort of chase the next lead. By the time I wrote Cornell, I'd written other books about the band and about the scene. So I had a pretty good Rolodex, to start with at that point.
Do you think you have another Grateful Dead book in you?
I didn't think I had that book in me, And I'll tell you the truth, when Cornell, the publisher at Cornell University was a Deadhead at that time, a really, really good dude. And he asked me to write that book, and I said no like 4 times, because I thought it was a straight, like, why? How do you write a whole book about a single show? I couldn't even wrap my head around how to do it, like from an artistic standpoint. But the reason I said no is the exact reason I eventually said yes, because I thought it would be really interesting as an artistic project to write a whole book about a single show. And then it was, how do I do it? And you start looking at what was going on with the band at that time period. What was the culture like at that time period? It was the explosion of punk. And so you had the Sex Pistols like blowing up because they said, fuck on air, on some talk show in England. And you had all this stuff going on. And here's the Grateful Dead doing their thing, So just culturally, what was going on musically, what was going on with the band. Why did this show become so well known? And I had a great, really long conversation with Betty about that's in there and her role in it and the way that she taped, which Liam, if you haven't read that, you might really, really, as a sound person, appreciate, where she was coming from. It was really cool. And at one point she said, I'm not, because most people who do sound they might consider themselves sound reinforcement, right? So we're taking what the band is doing and then reinforcing it and making sure it comes to your ears really good. And she has a great quote in there. She said, I wasn't sound reinforcement. I was sound. And so basically she wasn't mixing for the audience. She wasn't mixing for the room. She was mixing as a fan for her own ears. And that's why a large part of why Betty's recordings are so special, because she heard kind of like what we would want to hear. And she wasn't worrying about the room, And she loved Jerry so much. She loved the music so much, and loved Jerry so much, and shared a lot about Jerry coming over after shows, especially Jerry band shows that she taped, and actually listening to them. And so just, I don't know, anytime you do an artistic project, especially in this community, it's just cool. If you get off on meeting people who get off on the stuff you get off on, like, there's nothing better, I love sitting here with you guys and watching your brains work and listening to your rationale. Like, it makes me so fucking happy to be a Deadhead, just to meet you all and listen to you. I love it.
Were there any books about single concerts you were able to draw inspiration from?
No, I don't know a single one, And again, that's what sort of made me say no at first is what made me say yes. And I will tell you the truth. I think I cracked the code. Like, I think at this point I could write a book about pretty much any show. I think I know how to do it, And I was approached about doing a different show that I bet there'd be a lot of nods if I told you the show, but I'm not going to tell you what that is. But it was close to this one, let's put it that way. So I might do that again. I don't know. It was kind of fun.
So 2 people were closest, Charles and John, who guessed 86. They were 1 year off of the 87. Yeah, John, tell us about 86. That's a good guess right there.
I knew it was later Esau because it seemed well put together. I definitely had a run with that song where I listened to most versions, and it definitely changed a lot from 83 to 87. It is a shame that they kind of stopped playing it. Obviously Bobby picked it back up with Wolf Bros, but I knew it had to be a later Esau, and I knew that I knew they stopped in 87, so I was just kind of like, I'll go with 86 just in case it's like 85, because I listened to a recent episode of this podcast and it was the 85 version of Esau. And so I was like, I'll just go 86. But I love Esau. It's a great example of Bobby playing the slide very tastefully, like Samson, like Althea, everybody shits on Bob as a slide player, but I think that this is like a really, really good showcase of his abilities with the slide.
And yeah, Charles, you were thinking the same thing. Also 86.
Yeah, so a couple things. So I knew it was Esau, and I think a lot of those In the Dark songs came out in '83 live, like Touch of Grey, Throwing Stones, Esau. And I remember hearing some earlier versions of that where the lyrics might have been a little different. I think Bob changed the lyrics, so I was like, okay, I was waiting for that weird lyric to tell me it was an early one, and I didn't hear it. It sounded like the lyric that's on the album. And then tone-wise, I went with 86. It sounded a little bit dirtier than 87 usually does. 86 has a dirty element to it. It's hard to articulate, but 87 is usually a little cleaner. And then the last thing I wrote down, so I grew up about an hour and a half south of Rochester, and I've been to Silver Stadium several times. My high school baseball team played in the Section 5 finals there. And I'm thinking, all right, well, Peter probably went to the Silver Stadium show. And I couldn't remember if it was 86 or 87, and I already wrote down 86. So I was thinking Silver Stadium there. But yeah. And also, I will say, Peter, I listened to your book on Audible probably about a year ago. So it's very cool. And anyway, that's why I chose 86.
Way to go, Charles. Sean was 2 years off, 89.
Obviously, I did not know that they dropped this in 87. 80s are definitely not my strong suit for the Dead. Like I know I've been listening to a lot more 80s lately, but those 4 years, 83 to 87, I have not listened to hardly anything from those years. So I didn't even know it was My Brother Esau until Bob started singing, and it was just a shot in the dark.
And Liam, 83.
Nowhere close. Nowhere close. Honestly, I thought the tone was closest to 83. I wasn't paying attention to the lyric changes and whatnot. I think the thing that was messing with me the most was The Matrix. I thought it was one of those like Southern shows from 1983, but that's part of the game. It is what it is.
Way to go. Before we go on to the second song of the 3-song 4-person finals, making up shit as I go over here. John, how'd you get into the Dead?
Oh man, YouTube. Yeah, YouTube. I grew up on a farm. Didn't know anyone that listened to the Dead. Never really even heard about the Dead. But I listened to this YouTube channel, Playing for Change, that did like covers of popular songs that would just feature people from all over the world. It's like a nonprofit. I listened to those. And Ripple, they released Ripple on there, and I saw Ripple, Grateful Dead, and I was like, Grateful Dead, like that is like a metal band or something. I had no clue. And like I listened to the song, and I was like, that's the most beautiful song I've ever heard in my life, And so it just opened up a wormhole for me, and from there, you go to Franklin's Tower, you go to Broke Down, you go to Terrapin, and you just continually dig deeper and deeper and deeper. And it was really weird because I had one friend who like at the same time started listening to Althea, and I would always try to talk to him about the Grateful Dead, and he only liked the one song. He couldn't speak to anything else. So I was kind of like in this world alone. And then I went to college, and then a few other people knew of the Dead, but it was still like early Dead and Co years. They really hadn't gained a lot of steam yet. But in summer of 2017. They were playing in Atlanta, which was like the closest show to me. So like 4.5-hour drive from my hometown in Kentucky, on the border of Kentucky and Tennessee. And I told my mom I was going with one of my buddies from college. And I just was going solo. So I drove down to Atlanta, and it was really like my first real concert I had ever went to. And I was alone, and I got there a little bit late, and I walked in and they were playing Dire Wolf, which I definitely knew. And I was like, oh, the first song's Dire Wolf. Well, I missed like Shakedown and like another song, Music Never Stopped or something like that before that. And like I just remember going in and just being like really like taken aback by just the scene, and because I had no idea. And I just kind of, I fell in love with it gradually, and from there it's just like a snowball. And I mean, it's been such an important part of my life. Bobby was such a figure that I looked up to, and still is, and like I'm just really thankful that I got to see him as many times that I did, and the music will always live on, and it's so important to me.
The jump from a farm to Queens is a big one. How did you acclimate?
I think when you want to be somewhere, you mentally prepare yourself beforehand, and like you don't hear a lot of people running around the city that talk like I do. I definitely have like a twang. I've kind of lost some of it, but Queens is like they call it the world's borough. So it's like, it's so diverse and like everyone's got their own like thing that they bring to the table. And like, that's kind of the beautiful thing about Queens and why I was really like attracted to Queens from the jump. And also Dead and Co at City Field in 2022 was my first trip to New York, also solo, and was like, I fell in love with New York from there. And it's funny how that works, right?
You have like a really well-respected, popular brand called Development and Research on Instagram, like apparel.
Yeah, I guess so. I don't really like to approach it like a brand too much because I try to approach it as more of an extension of myself and I guess my interests over time. I mean, it started as a vintage page back when I was in college, and like collecting Grateful Dead tees was like kind of my main thing. I was lucky enough to open a brick and mortar store with a couple of people in Lexington. Obviously, I'm not really involved in that anymore. But like the vintage clothing scene was such a important part of my life and still is to some extent. But I learned so much about the Grateful Dead through collecting the shirts. Like there's so much history that goes into like a garment. Like not only does the garment have characteristics itself, but also, the design itself, whether it relates to a specific show, a specific tour, specific designer, like there's so much history that goes into it. And it's such an important thing to the culture of the Grateful Dead that like it really deserves to be documented. And I know that Annabelle Walsh was on here as one of the pickers, maybe like a year ago, and she's super super knowledgeable. She's done a lot of research, on the textile history of the Grateful Dead, and it's so important. It's so important that we recognize the great designers over time, but also like the people who continue to design and support the culture is really important. Obviously, the scene is kind of fragmented with none of the original members touring. Like now people have transitioned, I guess, to other groups, but they still, that people still design dead tees, and it's really important culturally. I find that like we continue to do so, and really I approach it as like a labor of love.
But the next project you're really focusing on is the documentary on the venues.
I'm spending a lot of time on that. I am doing a lot of Billy String shows this summer and some Fish that I'm working on some stuff for. But simultaneously, I'm also working on that documentary as well. So I've definitely got my hands full with that and full-time job, and it's a lot to juggle, but it is something I'm passionate about. I'm passionate about the Grateful Dead. I'm passionate about music in general, and I really enjoy just learning more about the history.
Way to go, man. Thank you. Appreciate it. All right, let's hear the next track. Let's resume our competition.
Oh, I started out on Heineken, but I soon hit the harder stuff.
Just like Tom Thumb's Blues at Hershey Park Stadium in Hershey, Pennsylvania on June 28th, 1985. Peter, Phil sounded great.
Yeah, let me just say, Sean, I'm so sorry. I really, you keep saying this isn't a sweet spot, and I picked a bunch that are right in your blind spots.
You
So I
gave me
apologize.
173 tracks. So
Yeah. After you said that, I looked at the list. I'm like, oh shit, sorry, dude. So this, it's funny because we talked about why Cornell is great. And I think in some ways you can give the Cornell show to just about anybody and give them a taste of the Grateful Dead without maybe freaking them out too much, especially like the first set. This is almost the opposite. Like, if you can give somebody this 85 Tom Thumbs from Hershey Park and they're willing to like roll with it and maybe listen to more, you've probably got a dead fan for life because it's the weirdest. It's just a really weird song. It's a weird rendition of it. And, John said he got pulled in by the song Ripple. And so my experience, this was actually the first bootleg that I had, and I was like 14 or 15. And I listened to that song and I was like, I don't even know what I'm listening to. Like, I couldn't, even to the extent of like, I'm not even sure this is music. I just never heard anything like it before to compare it to. And I was, a big music fan for life. And then I got American Beauty and I heard the song Ripple. And I was a young sort of poet and I love language. And I called up the friend who had given me the Hershey Park tape and I was like, why didn't you tell me about Ripple? Holy shit. What? And then my whole thing was like, how does the band who played this Tom Thumbs Blues also perform, everything Ripple? I couldn't even put those things together. And I've kind of spent the rest of my life trying to figure it out, to be honest with you, and enjoy like the space in between Ripple and that Tom Thumbs Blues and everything that comes between. So I love it. I love it to death. Yeah.
You mentioned you write poetry. You also write fiction. You write nonfiction. How do you decide what type of book is going to be next?
I just kind of go with where the energy is, what's pulling me in, right? Because I do this stuff because I love it and I love language and I love words. So if I'm in a phase where I'm just writing poetry, then that's what I'll write. I do it, I can do that because I don't have any expectations about what's going to happen with the product. The main thing is the process itself, which I really love. So most recently, I've been working on and basically just finished a novel about, my last book was called Merch Table Blues, and I called it Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll Murder Mystery. It's a band out of Burlington that's touring up and down the East Coast, and there's murders that are going on at the different venues. And and you're hearing about this first person through the eyes of a roadie, a guy and at that point, he's the only one doing anything, right? He's setting up the merch table, he's helping with the equipment, everything like that. There's a cult that appears in that book. And to answer your question of why that one, I felt like the cult leader didn't get his say in that book. And like he kept coming to me and saying, like, tell my story, tell my story, tell my story, tell my story. And I don't think I could have not written this one because he was really insistently telling me to tell his story. And it went all sorts of places I didn't expect. So that's a manuscript in progress, I would say. And that's why I wrote that one in particular. But it's kind of wherever the energy is, or in the case of Cornell, being, presented with something and then being kind of fascinated with how to do that thing and to pull it off.
In the murder mystery, is the band from Burlington a quartet?
Yeah. 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 And I mean, it's going to sound more based on Fish than it is. And it is in the loosest sense, but there's no musicians in there that are like the people in Fish. But the idea, I actually had my college band, the guys moved to Burlington and they were going to base themselves out of there and start playing up and down the East Coast. So it's actually more based on my buddies, who were playing out of Burlington. But, Nectar's is in there, but I call it something different. And I spent a lot of time mostly chasing Fish and all those 90s bands up and down those little clubs up and down the East Coast when they first started getting going in the early 90s. So it was based not on the musicians in Fish, but certainly on where I was seeing them a lot at that time and where my own buddies were playing, and then just musicians that I know. And, I've always been kind of fascinated by people talking about a cult, So when I was 10 years old, my parents took me to Lake Placid, and it was 1980. It was right after the Olympics had been there. Well, the Dead had just played there. So I was curious, and I didn't think of this till years later, but my parents used to say, they'll kidnap you and they'll take you away. And my grandmother was born in 1899, and she used to say, the gypsies will take you away. That's what she grew up with, And so it was kind of like, the Grateful Dead will take you away like the gypsies would take you away. This is some old school shit that nobody says anymore, by the way. I am very aware of that. But that's what my memory was, you know what I mean? So I was always intrigued by the idea of people would say, oh, that band has a cult following, right? They have a cult following. And so I was like, well, what if there actually was a cult? What if this is true and there was a cult that was around? And, I don't know. I guess they're still around, but when I was touring a lot, the Oshawas were a big presence with a big sort of bus that everybody would go on. And that was a cult that was preying on the scene at that time. And I saw them come in at a Fish show in the mid-90s somewhere, and I think it was Worcester. The first time I saw that Oshawa bus roll up at a Fish show, and I kind of knew that the scene was turning at that point. So there are a lot of people to prey on the scene too, and I kind of wanted to explore that as well.
Do you think there's such thing as a benign cult?
Sure. But, benign in as far as any organized religion for the most part is a cult. They got some far out ideas that people buy into. And unfortunately, most of them don't they end up being pretty destructive. So I think there's cults are very much more common than we want to believe, because I think there's a lot more things that would classify as cults. But anytime you have sort of power trips like that, they tend to go bad.
Okay. Charles and Liam both got it 85. Really impressive, Liam. How sure were you?
100%.
It seemed like it. Why?
I know that show. I'm pretty fond of that show. I actually have grown really accustomed to 85 recently. At the beginning, I was kind of perplexed with the sound. I was actually leaning towards not mid-90s, but mid-90s for the Dead, so like 93. But towards the later half, I was sold on 85. I mean, they had the first Tom's Thumb a few weeks earlier in Uniondale. That was like the third or fourth. Just a solid rendition overall, and probably the best of that first crop of Tom Thumbs.
What's the best year for Tom Thumbs?
I think they're the best in 85, to be honest, when they're fresh.
Nice pull, Liam. Charles, were you sure it was 85 too?
I was not sure. I have to give it to Peter, because that was another one where I wrote down, what is the song? I was like, I kind of know those chord changes. And initially I wrote down 83, just because it sounded like 83 a little bit to me. And then as soon as Phil comes in and starts singing, I'm like, oh, it's Tom Thumb. And so I know in 85, like Phil sang a lot. I think it's like, why don't we do it in the road? Give me some lovin'. I've heard some Tom Thumbs. So I went with 85, and luckily I got it.
Damn, way to go, Charles. Sean guessed 92, John guessed 93. Yeah, Sean, tell us 92.
Initially, at first, just sounded 90. I couldn't place it. And if anything, there was actually right before Phil started singing again, Brent did something on keys that to me sounded more Vince, like the key tone that he was using. And again, this is like Peter said, this is my weak spot, and it's just a shot in the dark.
John, 93.
Yeah. I don't know what I was thinking, I guess. I wrote down 89, 90, 91, 92, and I guess I just settled on 93 at the end there, which after I looked up the amount of times they played it, and they played it 13 times in 93, which was almost double any other year. So I don't know. I just thought it was then, and I was definitely very off. So it is what it is.
Sure. Before we go on to the third song of the finals, Sean, how'd you get into the Dead?
So both my parents were Deadheads. My mom especially. I think she said she saw them like 40 times. Funnily enough, all these years that I'm not familiar with would have been like 85, 86. She was going to a lot of them. So I was always like kind of familiar with the Dead. I knew like a handful of songs, but I didn't really dive into it until about 2 years ago, after basically a year of fucking around, quitting my job, did a whole big like road trip, and then I was working part-time, and then when I finally had to like, all right, I got to go back to the real world, and I started working a 9 to 5 again, I was just so bored sitting at work, and I've always been like a very obsessive personality, so like if I get into an artist, that's all I'm gonna listen to until I'm done with it. And I was like, I need a new artist to listen to, and I had on my Spotify like liked songs, I had the Franklin's Tower from August 13th, 75, the one from the Vault show, and I was like, you know what? I've never really given the Dead a chance. Let's just see what this show is like. And that's the one where Bill Graham does that, like, it's like a hype intro, and they're all like slowly tapping in one of it, and he goes, he's like, would you welcome please the Grateful Dead, and they just launch into Help on the Way. And it was that moment I was like, damn it, this is going to be my whole thing for the next who knows how long. It's not like when I've been into other bands. Like I was really into Bob Dylan and the band, and I got really into the Beatles when I was younger. But I've made like a lot of very close friends in the last couple of years, and in every case, it's like a conversation that starts out about the Dead. Like I ended up joining a band. Now I'm in like a Dead cover band with 4 other guys around my age who, it just kind of happened one day. And then it's so interesting to me. Like part of why I love it is everyone comes at it from a different angle, and everyone brings their own meaning and significance to the songs. And so like to talk with my friends about a certain song that we both love, but to hear that they love it for a completely different reason than I do. There's so much depth. There's always more to explore. And I used to make fun of Deadheads when I was in high school because my older brother went off to college and became like a big Deadhead, and I used to make fun of him. And now he's like, you're worse than me. So.
What's your instrument in the band?
I play drums, which I did not play drums before joining this band. So that was a whole other story, but it's been a ton of fun. We're basically a Dead cover band at this point, but I need to do some shameless self-promotion. We're called Muddy River Junction. If you're in Boston or Massachusetts, look us up. We're on Instagram. We got stuff coming up this summer, but gaining a whole new appreciation when you actually like play the songs and like learn the internal workings of it. There's a whole other layer to it now. So like certain songs that I didn't really love listening to, I love playing just because they have, I see it from the other side.
How do you gauge your progress behind the kit?
Mostly by how many like dirty looks our bass player gives me. If I drop a stick, just something slips or something's not where it should be, he shoots me a dirty look. He'll be pissed at me for saying this, but don't cut this.
Okay, I won't.
And I also just feel way more comfortable playing. Like when we first started, we were just practicing. We weren't gigging anywhere the first couple of months. I would be fighting for my life back there. And now just feel much more relaxed and like can actually listen to what everyone else is doing.
Cool. Well, defending champ Charles has 1. Liam's right behind him with 4. And Sean and John are at 9 with 1 track left. The guesses are in. Help on the Way at War Memorial Auditorium in Buffalo, New York on May 9th, 1977.
Oh, how did I miss that? I love that show. God damn it.
Peter, tell us about that show. Is it better than Cornell?
Well, I tell you that the start of that show is fire. That helped. And when I was doing the book, and I'm badly can't remember the person who said this, it's right in the beginning of the book. And his theory was that Buffalo are the 3rd and 4th sets of Cornell. And I thought it was a really interesting argument because they come out firing on that Help Slip Frank, and there's no like, we're going to warm up a little, we're going to touch the sound system, we're going to drop some clams here and there. Like they come out just firing on all cylinders at the beginning of that show, and they keep it up throughout. But the start of that show is just absolutely phenomenal. I'd put it up against anything. And, I wanted to do something from 77, but Cornell was a little too on the nose, so I shifted off of that.
Well, before we get the results from these guys, how did you get into the Dead, Peter? and come to write this book that's fantastic. And again, I can't recommend enough.
Yeah, thank you. Again, I was in high school and somebody gave me a copy of Hershey Park, and I was intrigued, and then I just started chasing it down. And like a lot of us, was around some people who had access to maybe not. I'm aging myself here. There was no internet. You know what I mean? So I was chasing tapes and chasing the highest quality tapes that I could get, which was when you first got into the band was usually often not very good. So that was it, tapes. And then as soon as I could, I went to a show, which was that Kingswood show we listened to. And I was 16 years old at that time. And I felt like I was going home. I went there, and I wasn't somebody who was having success in school. I wasn't kind of clicking with the things that, you were supposed to click with at that time, whether it was sports or academics or whatever. But I was really interested in the world, and I wanted to learn, and I loved language and I loved writing. And so I felt like here is a whole world to explore that made more sense to me than the one I was supposed to be, sort of living in and understanding. And then I got into, then I realized like, oh, like this band was inspired by, Jack Kerouac and the Beat Writers. Well, who are they? So now I'm reading books because of the Grateful Dead, or I'm looking at films differently, and I'm looking at visual art differently. And you start chasing down the influences, well, what do you mean Jerry was a bluegrass player? What the hell's bluegrass? You know what I mean? So you start chasing down the influences, and it opens up this whole world. And that's the world I was really interested in. And also, meeting at that time, there were still like original, 1960s folks on tour, and just sitting and talking to people who were in the hate, you know what I mean? And sort of like picking their brains and hearing what they had to say. And I guess I was probably researching and interviewing for my books before I knew what I was doing. I wasn't doing it consciously. I was just really curious, and I was interested. And the other thing that happened that really got me going was I danced. And as a teenage boy, it wasn't cool to dance. Like I wasn't going to dance. I wasn't going to go to a school dance, or whatever. Like dancing wasn't cool. And all of a sudden it was the best thing that I could imagine doing. And I just crossed over some barrier, and this idea of being able to celebrate with dance and song and community, it all came together into what I can only describe as we've all sort of touched into that, some sort of, quasi-religious, quasi-mystical experience, that changed me, and transformed me. And I'm so grateful to have had that experience. And I still, every single day, listen to the Grateful Dead, and love it. And just, I don't know. I'm so happy that they came into my life. It's enriched it immeasurably.
You mentioned that you were struggling in school except for writing. When did you realize that, like, that's fine as long as you really like writing and want to do that? You don't need to be good at the other subjects.
It takes a long time, I mean, so I've been fortunate to have a career in publishing, and I run a publishing house called Boa Editions that's been around for 50 years. I've been there for 22 years. So I got comfortable probably fully with it once I was in there and I could like pay my bills and I had a job in writing, in publishing, and it gave me a little bit more space to not have to sweat every single penny, than I had to sweat every third penny or whatever like that. But, it's a nonprofit poetry publishing house. I'm not exactly rolling in the dough in it. You know what I mean? But to have some space and to feel like I can actually carve out, I'm a parent, I got 3 kids. I can like carve out a grown-up's life in this thing and do what I'm passionate about, which is words and language, and helping other people find their creative expression too, which is really rewarding in what I do.
Is the next generation of poets as robust as your generation? And if not, is that a cause for concern?
People love language, and every generation's going to find their poets who sort of express where that generation is coming from. And I call it their utterance. They figure out how to make their own singular utterance that defines them or where they're coming from. I think one difference is there's a lot more fragmentation in how people see themselves. So you might have had 3 niches before, and now there's like 47. So somebody who might express themselves and express a certain community or whatever it might be, that's, there's a lot more narrow subgenres as opposed to like, straight or hippie or whatever it might be. You know what I mean? It was like, so that's interesting. That's interesting to me that I've seen shift is just getting a lot more voices at the table and hearing a lot more people's experiences and those people having access to the mechanisms that are publishing that gets their words out there that they didn't have access to before. And thanks to independent publishers and independent artists who support them, those voices do get heard. Without independence, that doesn't happen. That's not a corporate thing. So we got to support independent artists. We got to support independent musicians, writers, all those people to make sure those voices keep coming through, because without our support, they don't.
Beautiful summation, especially for this group. Entrepreneurs, filmmakers, musicians. Charles is a musician as well. He's mentioned it, but he's a musician as well. And so John was the only one who got it in 1977. What were you thinking?
I was playing the game. And that's the one time it really worked out for me, I guess. It did sound like something in that 75, 77 range of the band, but I wasn't really for sure, but I would assume that there would be a 77 show in here. So that's what I guess. And I did misspeak earlier in this episode. I want to correct it because I know that, the interesting thing about the Dead community, which has already been mentioned in this episode, is like they are pretty obsessive. And I feel like when a younger head misspeaks, it's like, who's the first one to cast a stone? I did say that Ngana show and the Fillmore show, that was like the first run that Dead did in New York City. It's not right. They played, their first show was Tompkins Square Park in 68, I believe. And then they did some shows at Cafe A Go, 67, and then they did some shows at Cafe A Go. So especially if you were at those shows, please hit me up.
I have a friend who was at Cafe A Go, so if maybe Mike can connect us and I can connect you to him.
That would be incredible.
He has a great story about peeing next to Pigpen. And he said Weir was the most beautiful human being he'd ever seen. He was like fascinated by this sort of male-female like sort of crossover that Weir embodied. But yeah, he was at that Cafe A Go in I think 68.
That would be
so
awesome.
I'm happy to connect you. Yeah.
Damn, there you have it. So Charles guessed 76, Sean guessed 78, Liam guessed 75. So Charles, 3-peats on Guest of the Year. Congratulations.
You win again.
Charles.
Jeez. that was, and I'm a Western New York guy, so like Rochester, it's killing me I didn't get the Buffalo show. Anyway, I was close enough.
Yeah, congratulations. Liam, so you thought it was one from the vault?
I was playing the game. Honestly,
Oh, okay.
I thought that it was a 76. I was pretty in on 76, but I would have honestly never guessed that it was that Buffalo show. And if I'm going to be honest, I don't really care for that Buffalo show.
Oh,
I know. Wild.
interesting.
Nothing against Buffalo. There's plenty of Buffalo shows I like, but I just think the shows that surround Barton Hall, personally, I honestly listen to Barton Hall probably 30 to 40 times a year. And then in close second is got to be Boston. I think the Boston show is absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, the one before, that's
Yeah.
a good show.
Yeah.
And there's definitely a lot of clunkers in Buffalo over the years, but I think
For sure.
that 77 show at the Odd, which was a killer old hockey rink, love that place. And then 89, I think, was,
Trucking up.
I mean, that's
Fantastic.
yeah.
I just
And
can't-
I thought 76 too, honestly. I mean, I
Yeah.
really thought either 75. I was thinking one from the vault because that came up earlier, but I just kind of played the game and put in 76.
I was playing
to be
against you at that point.
So Liam, you listen to Cornell 40 times a year.
No doubt. I mean, last year it was my number one listen. Actually, last 3 years, my number one listened to album. Last week alone, I listened to it 3 times. But it's just because of the recording style. There's definitely some. It's funny, like there's these shows that I get so attached to. Like there's this 1980 Cleveland show that I've been listening to over and over and over again recently. And it's not even like a standout show. Like overall, it's okay. But there's this one comes a time that just gets me so dialed in. I just owe everything of my interest just is like owed to this band. It just gives me so much more. Not only a sense of community, but a sense of belonging like every day for myself, just to have my opinion have a space for my opinion to be able to be shared. It's such a cool, interesting thing.
Yeah. I think a lot of people would echo that, Liam. Sean?
I was listening to the whole week of Cornell shows, 77. Because I've heard Cornell before, but I hadn't heard any of the others. And I actually had the opposite conclusion from Liam. I think Cornell's kind of the overrated one of the bunch. Like, I just listened to the Boston show yesterday, and I thought it was phenomenal. That Wharf Rat is got to be one of the best I've ever heard. Not to say that Cornell's a bad show. I don't want to be that guy, the contrarian deadhead who's like, oh, Cornell actually sucks.
There's like a 2-year period where every time I got in my car, I listened to One from the Vault on CD, partially just out of like convenience, but it's what I wanted to hear. So I totally get what you guys are saying, just obsessing over a specific sound.
And that One from the Vault show is my gateway completely into the dead. That was the first. My buddy had it on CD. It's probably like 1993 or something like that, and he burned me a cassette, and I was like, "Holy crap! They're awesome live." Then I listen to it back, 20, 25 years later, and like that's a damn good show. Like,
It was friends
for them
and
to put
family.
out. Yeah, it was a little
Too.
show. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fuck, I forget who we had on that was at the show. Oh, Joel Sullivan. He said it was just like a dog shit crowd.
Can I ask who won?
Charles won.
Yeah, Charles won.
Oh yeah, I won.
Okay,
to
thanks.
go,
I'm
man.
like, wait a minute.
Hey, thank you so much for listening. For all the show links, including our YouTube channel, check out the show notes. And if you want to be a contestant on the show, sponsor the show, or make comments and ask questions, email us at info@guesttheyear.net. A lot of the contestants mentioned their projects, and all of that is in the show notes, as well as, of course, Peter's amazing book. Shout out Dylan, James, and Jack for helping out behind the scenes. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks to the amazing tapers for recording some of the show possible. Congratulations, Charles, on the three-peat, and to other contestants, thanks for playing.
Good night. Good night. Good